June and Jennifer Gibbons, born on April 11, 1963 in Barbados, were identical twins who later moved to Haverfordwest, Wales, with their family. From an early age, the twins exhibited a peculiar bond that would become both fascinating and deeply unsettling. As children, they were socially isolated and developed a secret language that only they could understand, effectively shutting out the rest of the world. Their silence was so profound that they refused to speak to their parents, teachers, or even their siblings, communicating only with each other in a fast-paced, rhythmic speech that was incomprehensible to anyone else. As they grew older, their behavior became increasingly bizarre. The twins would often mirror each other's actions, moving in perfect synchrony, and exhibited a disturbing emotional dependency. If one twin experienced joy or pain, the other would feel it simultaneously. Their relationship, while intensely close, also had a dark, toxic side. They would sometimes fight viciously, even attempting to strangle each other, yet they were also inseparable, each seemingly unable to live without the other. During their teenage years, June and Jennifer began to withdraw even further from reality. They spent most of their time in their bedroom, creating elaborate and often disturbing stories, which they meticulously documented in journals. Their writings became increasingly dark and violent, reflecting their inner turmoil and psychological dissent. In their stories, they explored themes of crime, sexual deviancy, and mental illness, with characters that mirrored their own twisted relationship. In 1981, at the age of 18, the twins embarked on a crime spree that shocked their community. They committed acts of vandalism, theft, and arson, setting fire to a local school and a tractor store. Their crimes were not motivated by greed or malice, but rather by a desperate need to break free from the suffocating bond that held them captive. However, their actions led to their arrest, and they were eventually sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in Britain. At Broadmoor, the twins were kept in separate cells, which only intensified their psychological distress. Jennifer, who had always been the more dominant twin, began to exhibit strange physical symptoms, such as severe lethargy and a slow decline in health. Despite extensive medical tests, doctors could not determine the cause of her condition. Meanwhile, June, who had always been overshadowed by her sister, started to show signs of improvement, as if Jennifer's decline was somehow freeing her from the psychological prison she had been trapped in for years. In 1993, after 11 years at Broadmoor, the twins were transferred to a less restrictive facility. However, shortly after their arrival, Jennifer suddenly collapsed and died at the age of 29. The cause of death was acute myocarditis, a sudden inflammation of the heart, but no underlying cause was found. It was as if Jennifer had simply willed herself to die. After Jennifer's death, June began to speak more freely, explaining to a journalist that she and her sister had made a pact. One of them had to die for the other to live a normal life. Jennifer had sacrificed herself so that June could finally be free. Following her sister's death, June slowly integrated into society, although she remained haunted by the memory of her twin. The story of the Silent Twins is a disturbing and tragic tale of two sisters whose lives were inextricably linked by a bond that was both profound and destructive. Their eerie silence, bizarre behavior, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Jennifer's death have made their story one of the most chilling and enigmatic cases in the history of psychology. On the night of December 24, 1945, the Sodder family, George, Jenny, and their 9 children, were preparing to celebrate Christmas in their home. The Sodders were a well-respected family in Fayetteville. George, the father, was a successful businessman, and Jenny, the mother, was known for her kindness. The holiday spirit filled the house, and the children, ranging from 3 to 23 years old, were excitedly playing with their new toys and anticipating Christmas morning. At around 10 p.m., Jenny told the children it was time for bed. 5 of the younger children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, asked to stay up later to play with their new toys. Their mother agreed, as long as they remembered to turn off the lights and lock the doors. She then went upstairs with George and their other 4 children. Sometime after midnight, Jenny was startled awake by the sound of a heavy object hitting the roof and then rolling off. She paused, listening, but heard nothing more. Dismissing it as a fluke, she returned to sleep. About 30 minutes later, she awoke again, this time to the smell of smoke. She sprang out of bed and discovered that George's office, located below their bedroom, was in flames. Jenny woke George, and they quickly woke their 4 other children who were upstairs. As they frantically evacuated the house, they called out for the 5 younger children who had stayed up late. There was no response. The fire rapidly spread through the wooden structure, consuming everything in its path. The family escaped outside into the cold night, but George and Jenny realized the horror. They could not find Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. They were trapped inside the inferno. Panic-stricken, George tried everything to save his children. He ran to get his ladder to climb up to their second-story window, but the ladder was mysteriously missing from its usual spot. He thought of driving his truck up to the house to climb on top of it, but the truck wouldn't start, despite it working perfectly the day before. Frantic, George tried to fetch water from a rain barrel to put out the flames, but the water inside was frozen solid. Meanwhile, Jenny tried to call the fire department, but the phone line was dead. A neighbor who saw the flames drove to a nearby tavern and made the call for help. It was Christmas Eve, and the fire department was understaffed. The response was delayed. The fire chief did not arrive until 8 a.m., long after the fire had reduced the house to ashes. When the fire was finally extinguished, there was no trace of the 5 children. No bodies, no bones, nothing. The fire chief suggested that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the bodies, but this claim was questionable. Many believe that some remains should have been found, as bones usually do not burn completely, even in intense fires. The Sodders began to suspect that the fire was not accidental, and strange clues seemed to support their suspicions. First, they discovered that their telephone line had not been burned in the fire but was cut, explaining why they couldn't call for help. A witness came forward to say that he had seen a man stealing a block and tackle from the property, which could explain the mysteriously missing ladder. There was also a report from another witness who saw a car drive away from the Sodder home during the fire, with someone inside throwing what appeared to be balls of fire onto the roof. Suddenly, Jenny's memory of hearing a thump and a rolling sound became more sinister. It could have been an incendiary device. The Sodders were relentless in their pursuit of the truth. They put up billboards, distributed flyers, and hired private investigators to find their children. A shocking number of unsettling clues surfaced over the years. A woman claimed she had seen the missing children in a car that drove by while the fire was raging. Another woman, who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she saw the children the morning after the fire, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction. She reported that she served them breakfast, but when she tried to engage the children in conversation, the adults became hostile and refused to let her speak to them. More bizarre still, Jenny conducted her own experiments with animal bones, burning them to see if they would turn to ash. None did. She consulted a crematorium, where she was told that bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, far longer and hotter than their house fire had burned. Years later, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Jenny, containing a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to her missing son, Louis. The back of the photo read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, a little boys, a 90,132 or 35. The cryptic message only deepened the mystery. The Sodders hired another private investigator to follow this lead, but he disappeared, and they never heard from him again. For the rest of their lives, George and Jenny Sodder searched for their missing children. They kept the billboard up on Route 16, offering a reward for information. Jenny wore black in mourning and kept a flower garden at the site of the burned home, maintaining it until her death in 1989. George died in 1969, never knowing the fate of his children. The surviving Sodder children and their descendants continue to seek answers, but the case remains unsolved. The absence of closure, the bizarre clues, and the eerie possibility that the children were taken and lived out their lives somewhere else add a terrifying, almost supernatural layer to the story. The disappearance of the Sodder children is not just an unsolved mystery. It's a story that leaves you feeling unsettled, with a sense that something deeply wrong happened that night. The truth, whatever it may be, is buried in layers of fear, suspicion, and horror. The Sodder family's tragedy continues to haunt those who learn of it, an eerie reminder of how the unknown can consume us in the most terrifying ways. On February 12, 1993, Denise Bulger went shopping at the New Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle, Merseyside, England, with her 2-year-old son, James. It was an ordinary day, and the mall was bustling with shoppers. As Denise paid for her purchases at a butcher's shop, she let go of James's hand for just a moment to retrieve her purse. That brief lapse, those few seconds, changed everything. Unbeknownst to Denise, 2 young boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, were lurking around the shopping center that day, looking for trouble. They had been skipping school and wandering around the mall, causing minor disruptions and trying to steal from various stores. However, their intentions were far more sinister than mere petty theft. As Denise turned her attention away, Thompson and Venables seized their opportunity. They spotted James standing near the door of the butcher shop, momentarily separated from his mother. The CCTV footage captured a chilling moment. Venables leaning down and whispering something to James, taking his hand and leading him away. It looked like an innocent scene, an older brother leading a younger sibling out of the store. But it was anything but innocent. Denise turned around, only to find that her son was gone. Panic set in immediately, and she started searching the shop, screaming his name. Meanwhile, Thompson and Venables calmly led James out of the mall. No one thought to question them. After all, what harm could 2 children possibly do? Over the next 2.5 miles, James was taken on a journey of unimaginable terror. The boys led him through busy streets, across a canal, and even through a park. Witnesses would later recall seeing a small boy crying, being dragged along by 2 older boys. Some intervened briefly, asking if the boy was okay, but were reassured by the older boys that he was their brother or that he was lost, and they were taking him to the police station. Tragically, no one stopped them. As they continued, Thompson and Venables' actions grew increasingly cruel. At one point, they took James to a canal and dropped him on his head, causing him to cry harder. Despite his visible distress, they continued to drag him along. The chilling audacity of the boys, who were only 10 years old themselves, shocked everyone who later learned of the crime. As the hours passed, they led him further from safety and deeper into their horrific plans. Eventually, the boys arrived at a disused railway line near Walton, Liverpool, an isolated and desolate area far from the crowded shopping center where the nightmare had begun. It was here that Thompson and Venables unleashed a level of brutality that defies comprehension. What followed was a series of sadistic acts. They began throwing bricks and stones at James, kicking and beating him. They stripped off his shoes and undressed him from the waist down. They then poured blue modeling paint into his eyes, blinding him and causing excruciating pain. James, a defenseless toddler, screamed for his mother, but his cries were met with cold indifference. The boys continued their assault, escalating in ferocity. At one point, they shoved batteries into his mouth, possibly attempting to force him to swallow them. Then, in a final act of unimaginable cruelty, they struck James in the head with a 22-pound iron bar. His tiny skull was shattered in multiple places. The violence was relentless, a sustained attack by 2 young boys who seemed detached from the reality of their actions. Believing James to be dead, they made a gruesome attempt to cover their tracks. They laid his battered body across the railway tracks and weighed it down with debris, hoping a train would hit him and make his death appear accidental. It was a final, brutal insult to the unimaginable suffering James had endured. 2 days later, on February 14, 1993, a group of children playing near the railway tracks discovered James's mutilated body. The scene was gruesome and beyond what anyone could have imagined. His small body was cut in half by a passing train, but the coroner's report revealed that he had died from the injuries inflicted before this. James's family was devastated, and the community was gripped by shock, disbelief, and outrage. The police quickly launched a massive investigation. Reviewing the CCTV footage from the shopping center, they spotted the grainy images of James being led away by 2 young boys. The sight was chilling. 2 young children calmly leading another to his death. The manhunt for the culprits, now identified as children themselves, began. Within days, Robert Thompson and John Venables were identified and arrested. When questioned by police, the boys initially denied everything. But as evidence mounted, including a paint stain found on one of the boys that matched the paint used on James, they began to crack. Their confessions were cold, detached, and disturbingly devoid of emotion. The trial of Thompson and Venables was highly publicized and intense. The courtroom was filled with tension and outrage as the world grappled with the incomprehensible fact that two 10-year-olds had committed such a heinous crime. The boys were tried as adults and found guilty of the murder of James Bulger, making them the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. They were sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, effectively an indefinite sentence with a minimum term. The murder of James Bulger is more than just a tragic story. It is a nightmare that continues to haunt anyone who hears it. The innocence of a child, snatched away in an instant, replaced by a chilling and senseless brutality. The story serves as a stark reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn into a horror, how evil can wear the face of innocence, and how the deepest fears can become a terrifying reality. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know when we release new videos exploring real-life horror stories.